Hello and welcome to your local anthropologist. I'm your host, Alina, and this is my series Utopia of Play, an anthropological lens on the modern workplace. Today's episode is a continuation from last week, looking at a history of the commons, the new enclosures, part 2. Techno-feudalism, the digital panopticon, and how all of this works in the modern workplace. Previously, in the last episode, we were looking at how the enclosure of the commons dispossessed a population and created the modern working class, first in England and then exported globally through colonialism. We looked at how the hedges go up, the fences get built, the commons transformed into private property. We saw how millions were pushed off the land and into a new relationship with work, no longer producing for subsistence but selling their labor for wages, entirely reliant on employers for survival. But this wasn't a one-time historical event. The process of primitive accumulation, of divorcing people from the means of sustaining their own lives, is a recurring logic of capitalism. As the political theorist Massimo de Angelis argues, capital is continually engaged in enclosing the commons, wherever they may arise, to create and recreate its necessary conditions for existence. Once you've enclosed all the physical land, you find new commons to privatize. Knowledge, culture, social relationships, human attention, time itself. The mechanism is always the same. Take something that was shared, autonomous, or outside market relations, fence it off, turn it into private property, and force people to pay for access or do without. Today we live under a new wave of enclosures. The fences are now digital, the fields are our data, our time, and the new lords of the manor are platform algorithms and tech billionaires. But the basic pattern, the separation of people from their means of autonomous existence, the creation of dependency, the siphoning of value from those with no other options, remains unchanged. This second part explores how the historical dynamics we uncovered are not just echoes, but active, shaping forces in the contemporary workplace and the digital sphere. We'll move from the digital economy's precarity to the warehouse's algorithmic surveillance, and finally to the emergence of what some theorists called techno-feudalism, a system where we are all tenants on a digital estate owned by a sovereign class, completing a narrative arc that stretches from the common fields of England to the cloud servers of the 21st century. But it's all one story, the story of enclosure. From commoners to the precariat, the legacy of wage dependency. The most direct legacy of historical enclosure is the insecurity faced by millions of workers today. We didn't just stumble into this arrangement. There are centuries of deliberate policy and violence behind the power dynamics that shape contemporary work. And the parallels between the dispossessed commoners of the 18th century and today's precarious workers are not merely metaphorical, but built into the system itself, reflecting a continuous logic of dispossession and control. The landless proletariat created by the Parliamentary Enclosure Acts finds its stark contemporary counterpart in what sociologist Guy Standing calls the precariat, a class defined not just by low wages but by chronic insecurity, lack of occupational identity, the absence of any stable relationship with capital. The gig economy workers driving for Uber, delivering for Deliveroo, shopping for Instacart are the clearest embodiment of this new precarious class. Today's version of dispossession, a Deliveroo cyclist ostensibly owns their means of production, the bicycle, the insulated bag, perhaps their phone, just as the cottager after enclosure technically owned their labor and maybe a few tools. But ownership of a bicycle doesn't translate into autonomy any more than owning a strong back did in 1800. The cyclist is reliant on the platform for work. They have no control over the algorithmic boss that assigns orders, rates their performance, and can deactivate their account, cutting off their income. Without warning, explanation, or recourse. They can't negotiate their rates, they can't refuse orders without penalty, they absorb all the risks, injury, equipment, failure, slow periods, while the platform takes the profits. This is not a free market of equals, despite the rhetoric of entrepreneurship and flexibility that platforms deploy. It is a system of profound dependency, mirroring the landless laborer's reliance on the enclosed farm owner. The Victorian factory worker had to show up at the factory gate hoping for a day's work. The gig worker has to log into the app, hoping the algorithm will send them orders. Same dependency, different technology. This enforced precarity is found again in the proliferation of zero-hour contracts, which now cover 1 million workers in the UK alone. These contracts offer no guarantee of work, employers are not obligated to provide any hours at all, but often include exclusivity clauses preventing workers from seeking employment elsewhere. It's a perfectly designed trap. You must be available whenever the employer wants, but the employer owes you nothing. You cannot plan childcare, you cannot budget for rent, you cannot turn down a shift without fearing you'll be punished with fewer hours next week. These are modern incarnation of the seasonal, uncertain labor that became the norm after enclosure. Day laborers waiting at the hiring fair hoping to be chosen. Harvest workers needed for 6 weeks then cast off. The same pattern, a workforce that is permanently available yet completely insecure, unable to plan for the future or assert their rights for fear of having their hours, and thus their livelihood, reduced to zero. This deliberate erosion of worker autonomy and security represents the final severance of the moral economy that once underpinned pre-capitalist social relations. Remember, as James C. Scott was arguing, in traditional agrarian societies, the moral economy was a system of reciprocal, if unequal, obligations. Peasants were exploited, yes, but their labor was essential, and that gave them leverage. When harvests failed, peasants could demand their lord open his grain stores. When rents rose too high, they could threaten to withhold labor or even revolt. Lords needed their peasants to survive, and peasants could use that need to enforce a basic principle: you don't let people starve. It wasn't equality, but it was a relationship of mutual dependency. By divorcing workers from the means of production, it dismantled the mutual dependence that had underpinned even exploitative relationships. When workers own nothing but their labor, when they can be easily replaced, when starvation is the alternative to accepting whatever work is offered, the subsistence ethic collapses. The relationship transforms from mutual, though unequal, dependence to one-sided exploitation. This process, as Standing notes, has accelerated dramatically with globalization and financialized capitalism. When capital is mobile and workers are not, when factories can relocate to wherever labor is cheapest, when gig economies can draw from a global pool of desperate workers, the last remnants of worker bargaining power evaporate. Elites abandon their obligations entirely, not out of personal cruelty necessarily, but because the system no longer compels them to maintain even the pretense of reciprocity. This historical pattern finds its starkest contemporary expression in platform capitalism and the billionaire class it has created. Tech monopolies and gig economy platforms extract staggering wealth while offering minimal security to the workers who generate it. The gig worker, who can be deactivated without warning, the warehouse employee driven by algorithmic speed-ups, the content moderator traumatized by whatever they must view, all of these have been structurally stripped of the power to demand a subsistence ethic, let alone anything approaching dignity or security. Meanwhile, these same corporations lobby against the taxes that would fund social infrastructure. They fight unionization efforts with sophisticated union-busting campaigns and deploy legal teams to maintain workers' classification as independent contractors rather than employees. This is a wholesale abandonment of responsibility, a return to the most brutal forms of extraction. Modern capital accumulation mirrors the dynamics that emerged during the destruction of the moral economy. It is a system of unprecedented extraction enabled by the systematic annihilation of worker leverage, a process that began with the enclosure of the commons and continues refined and intensified today. The Digital Panopticon, Surveillance and Discipline 2.0. If wage dependency is the economic inheritance of enclosure, then intensified surveillance is its managerial legacy. The disciplinary power that Michel Foucault analyzed in the factory, the prison, and the school, the architecture of constant visibility that produces obedient, self-regulating subjects, has now been encoded in software, refined by algorithms, and deployed at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the factory overseers of the 19th century. Foucault's key insight was that discipline doesn't require constant actual supervision. It requires the possibility of being watched at any moment. The panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's prison design where guards in a central tower can observe any cell without prisoners knowing when they were being watched, produced subjects who policed themselves. The design is such that it doesn't matter if anyone was actually in the tower. The architecture itself enforced compliance. Algorithmic management represents a quantum leap in this logic, a perfection of Bentham's design that eliminates human supervisors entirely. This is the enclosure of workers' time, attention, and bodies within a digital cage where every movement is tracked, every second accounted for, every deviation from optimum productivity flagged and punished. In Amazon warehouses, workers carry handheld scanners that don't just scan packages, they scan the workers themselves. These devices track time off task with ruthless precision, measuring the seconds between scans. Every bathroom break, every pause to catch your breath, every moment you're not actively moving product is recorded and aggregated. The system calculates your picking rate in real time and compares it to the rates of every other worker in the facility. Fall below the target rate, a target that increases as the algorithm observes what the fastest workers can achieve, and you'll receive a warning. Multiple warnings trigger automated termination. There's no human judgment involved, no consideration of whether you had to walk further because of how items were stocked, no recognition that you might be slower because you're injured or exhausted. The algorithm doesn't care. It sees numbers, productivity rates, and the gap between your output and the mathematical optimum. Workers describe the feeling as being hunted, the knowledge that the system is always watching, always measuring, always ready to replace you with someone who can move faster. One former Amazon worker described it as working like a robot while being monitored by a robot. This creates what Foucault called a self-policing workforce, but even more thoroughly than he imagined. The Victorian factory worker might slack off when the foreman's back was turned, but the algorithm never turns its back. Workers push themselves to injury trying to maintain impossible rates, knowing that falling behind means automatic termination, knowing there's a pool of desperate people ready to replace them. Delivery drivers for platforms like Deliveroo, Uber Eats, and Amazon Flex experience a mobile version of this surveillance. GPS tracking monitors their location continuously. The app knows when they've accepted an order, how long it took them to reach the restaurant, how long they waited, what route they took, how fast they traveled, exactly when they arrived at the customer's door. Any deviation from the algorithmically determined optimal route can be flagged. Taking a break, the app registers you as offline, and when you log back in, you may find yourself at the bottom of the queue for new orders, punished for needing to rest. The tracking extends beyond simple location data. Some platforms monitor engagement, how quickly drivers accept orders, how often they reject them, their customer ratings. All of this feeds into a score, a number that determines how much work the algorithm sends your way. Reject too many low-paying orders and your acceptance rate drops, and suddenly you're getting fewer pings. Complain to a customer or fail to perform the emotional labor of gratitude for their tip, and a bad rating can tank your access to work. The system gamifies exploitation, turning every interaction into a performance measured and judged by code. It's a high-tech panopticon, a digital enclosure where the feeling of constant surveillance ensures compliance and eliminates the autonomy once found in the temporal rhythms of the commons. In the pre-enclosure world, labor followed task orientation. You worked until the task was done, then you rested. You controlled the pace. Saint Monday was a recognized custom. Workers took Monday to recover from the weekend. The employers accepted this as the rhythm of human life. That autonomy is precisely what algorithmic management destroys. This logic of control extends beyond the obviously surveilled sectors of warehouses and delivery. The recent wave of return-to-office mandates, despite overwhelming evidence that remote work was successful and often more productive, can be interpreted as a managerial re-enclosure of flexible labor. During the pandemic, millions of office workers experienced a temporary loosening of direct supervision. They controlled their own time and space, logged in from home, often juggled care work alongside paid work in ways that would have been impossible in the office. And many discovered they preferred it. Not because it didn't work, productivity metrics largely held steady or improved, but because they gained back something that felt like autonomy. They could take a break when they needed one without performing busyness for a manager's benefit. They could structure their day around their own rhythms rather than the arbitrary 9 to 5. The rush to force workers back into offices, often justified with vague claims about collaboration, company culture, is really about asserting control. In physical offices, presence is visible and therefore manageable. Managers can see if you're at your desk, they can monitor when you arrive and leave, they can observe your informal interactions, your bathroom breaks, your lunch habits. Even if they're not actively watching, the architecture creates the possibility of surveillance, which, as Foucault showed, is often enough. The return to office mandate is an effort to reassert a form of spatial and temporal discipline that was temporarily loosened to re-enclose workers within a supervised space. These environments, governed by what David Graeber called the structural violence of bureaucracy, reveal how corporate hierarchies function as administrative machinery to enforce compliance upon those with the least power. The Amazon worker cannot argue with the metrics, cannot complain to the algorithm why his work took too long. The system doesn't care about context, about human variation, about the reality that some problems take longer than others. It only sees numbers, only deviation from the mean, only opportunities to squeeze more productivity from human bodies and minds. This is enclosure at the level of milliseconds and micro-movements. The common land at least offered space to breathe, to rest between tasks, to move according to the rhythms of your own body and the natural world. The digital panopticon encloses every second, every gesture, every interaction within a framework of measurement and control. It is the perfection of the disciplinary logic that began in the early factories, but now, with nowhere left to hide, no moment unwatched, no movement untracked. Techno-feudalism and the digital enclosure. One of the most profound contemporary enclosures, however, is happening not in the warehouse or the call center, but in the very fabric of our digital lives. We're watching capitalism transform into something else entirely, and understanding this shift requires us to think beyond the traditional categories of market economics. A new economic paradigm is emerging, which economist Yanis Varoufakis terms techno-feudalism, and the name is more than provocative rhetoric. It captures a genuine transformation in how power and extraction function in the digital age. What makes this feudal? Under classic capitalism, the market was the central organizing mechanism. Under techno-feudalism, the market is being replaced by what Varoufakis calls the digital fiefdom. We are now witnessing a return to the feudal relations of power, but now the manor is a digital platform and the land being enclosed is human attention, social connection, and the collective data we generate simply by living our lives online. Think about how feudalism actually worked. A lord owned land, not through productive use but through legal title, often granted by conquest or inherited through bloodlines. Peasants who wanted to survive had to work that land, and in exchange they paid rent to the lord in the form of labor service, a share of their crops, or fees using the lord's mill or oven. The lord extracted value not by producing anything or competing in a market, but simply by owning the essential resource, the land, and charging for access to it. The relationship was not one of market exchange between equals, but of dependence backed by legal and military force. Now look at Amazon. You want to sell products online? You don't truly operate in a free market. You operate on Amazon's platform, and for that privilege, you pay tribute, a substantial commission on every sale, fees for storage if you use their fulfillment centers, fees for advertising if you want your products to be visible. Amazon doesn't compete with you in a market. It owns the market itself, the digital space where exchange happens, and it charges rent from everyone who needs access to that space. The more essential the platform becomes, the more it monopolizes the digital marketplace, the more it can charge because sellers have no alternative. Jeff Bezos is not primarily a capitalist in the traditional sense. He's a digital feudal lord collecting rent from everyone who needs to use his platform to reach customers. And, like feudal lords, platform owners use their control over essential infrastructure to extract ever greater shares of the value created by others' labor. The feudal logic operates even more clearly on social media platforms. You don't pay Facebook or Instagram in money to use their services, but you pay in something far more valuable: your data, your attention, your social relationships, and your unpaid labor creating content that keeps other users engaged. Think about what you're actually doing when you use these platforms. You're creating content, photos, posts, comments, videos. You're building and maintaining social networks. You're generating data about your preferences, your relationships, your movements, your interests. All of this is valuable. It's labor, even if it doesn't feel like work. And all of this is happening on digital territory owned by Meta, ByteDance, Elon Musk. You don't own your social network on Facebook. Facebook does. You can't take your followers with you if you leave. You can't export your photos and videos in a format that preserves their social context. You don't control the algorithm that determines what you see or who sees your posts. You are sharecropping on Mark Zuckerberg's digital estate. You work the social soil, create posts, building networks, generating engagement, and the Lord of the Manor takes the harvest, your data, your attention, the value of your network, and lets you keep just enough, the ability to stay connected to friends and family, that you'll keep working his land. It really is techno-feudalism. These platforms have replaced the market mechanism with a more direct form of rent-seeking. They don't need to compete for your business in a meaningful way because they've achieved near monopoly status in their domains. Facebook doesn't need to offer you a better deal because all your friends are already on there. Amazon doesn't need to treat sellers fairly because where else are sellers going to reach that many customers? The platform is the infrastructure, and the infrastructure ownership in a digital age functions like land ownership in a feudal age. It's the foundation of all economic activity, and whoever controls it can demand payment from everyone else. The latest common: data. This brings us to our latest yet no less insidious enclosure: the privatization of data. Data is the new commons, a collectively generated resource that is being fenced off, privatized, and used to generate immense wealth and power for a new techno-aristocracy. Every time you search on Google, shop on Amazon, scroll through Instagram, navigate with Google Maps, you're generating data. That data is not just about you as an individual. It's relational, social, collective. Your purchasing patterns are valuable partly because they can be aggregated with millions of others to reveal trends. Your location data is valuable because it shows how people move through cities. Your social network is valuable because it maps human relationships at scale. This is a commons in the truest sense, a shared resource created through collective human activity. But unlike the historical commons, where at least local communities had some control over how their shared resources were managed, this new digital commons is being enclosed and privatized without any democratic input whatsoever. And let's be honest, it doesn't help that our politicians barely understand these technologies, let alone how to regulate them, leaving legislation years behind the companies themselves. Tech companies claim this data as their private property, not through any legitimate process of creation. You created it, after all, but through terms of service that no one reads and wouldn't have a real choice to refuse even if they did. Shoshana Zuboff, in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, meticulously details how this process works. She describes it as the unilateral claiming of private human experience as free, raw material for translation into behavioral data. Companies don't just passively collect data you knowingly provide, they actively surveil your behavior to generate data you never intended to share. How long you hesitate before clicking, where your eyes linger on a web page, the tone of your voice on a smart speaker, your walking speed captured by your phone. All of this is harvested, analyzed, and turned into predictions about your future behavior. These data points aren't just used to show you ads, though there is that too. They're used to modify your behavior, to nudge you toward actions that benefit the platform and its paying customers. The goal is not just to predict what you'll do, but to ensure you do what's profitable for them. When Instagram's algorithm decides to show you fitness influencers after you've lingered on weight loss content, or when TikTok keeps serving you just one more video calibrated precisely to your engagement patterns, it's not passive prediction. It's active shaping of your behavior, operating below the threshold of consciousness through subtle manipulations of what you see, when you see it, how it's framed, designed to guide you toward clicking, buying, staying engaged. Zuboff calls this instrumentarianism, the instrumentation of behavior for the purpose of modification, prediction, and control. It's a form of power that is unprecedented in human history. Not in its goals, elites have always wanted to control populations, but in its means, the ability to observe, analyze, and influence billions of people in real time, individually and collectively through digital infrastructure that has become essential to modern life. This is primitive accumulation as radical as the seizure of the common lands, perhaps more so. The enclosure of the commons took land that communities had used for generations and turned it into private property. The enclosure of human experience takes your thoughts, movements, relationships, and attention, the most intimate aspects of being human, and turns them into private property, into raw material for profit and control. Intellectual property law serves as the legal fencing tool for this new enclosure, mirroring the Parliamentary Enclosure Acts of the 18th century. Just as those acts gave legal sanction to landlords seizing common fields, IP law gives legal sanction to corporations seizing collective knowledge and human creativity. Huge amounts of human knowledge, life-saving medicines, agricultural seeds, the underlying code of artificial intelligence, academic research, are locked away behind patent walls and proprietary software. When Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, someone asked who owned the patent. Well, the people, I would say, he replied. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? That ethic that some things are too important, too much the product of collective human effort to be privately owned, has been almost completely abandoned. Now pharmaceutical companies patent drugs developed using publicly funded research and charge prices that put life-saving treatments out of reach for millions. Monsanto patents seeds, the foundation of agriculture for 10,000 years, and sues farmers whose crops are contaminated by pollen drift from patented plants. AI companies train their models on the collective output of human creativity scraped from the internet without compensation, and then claim the resulting models as proprietary technology. This restricts innovation, blocks access to knowledge, and ensures that the benefits of collective human ingenuity are privately captured by whoever can afford the lawyers to file the patents and enforce the copyrights. The university researcher whose work led to a breakthrough doesn't profit. The pharmaceutical company that patented the application does. The writers and artists whose work trained the AI don't profit. OpenAI and its investors do. But digital commons exist, and perhaps they offer a form of resistance. Open source software like Linux powers most of the world's servers and smartphones, collectively built, democratically governed, freely available. Wikipedia has become one of humanity's most comprehensive knowledge repositories, written and edited by millions of volunteers, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, though they are currently fighting for survival against AI tech. Even in AI development, resistance to enclosure is emerging. Open source AI models, open data sets, and initiatives for data dignity and data sovereignty represent attempts to maintain the commons in the face of corporate enclosure. These efforts prove that the principles from Ostrom that identified that clear boundaries, community-led governance, participatory decision-making, fair conflict resolution mechanisms are just as applicable to digital resources as they were to common pastures. The struggle is asymmetric, certainly. A handful of platform monopolies control infrastructure that billions depend on, while the digital common movements operate with volunteer labor and limited resources. But the fact that these commons exist and that they work, that they often produce better outcomes than proprietary alternatives, for example, Wikipedia versus Encarta or Linux versus Windows, demonstrates that there are alternatives to the techno-feudal model. The question is whether we'll organize politically to defend and expand these commons, or whether we'll allow them to be enclosed one by one until all of the digital life is owned and controlled by a new aristocratic class. Recommoning. Despite the scale of these new enclosures, the spirit of the commons endures, fueling a diverse array of contemporary struggles. Just as commoners fought back with fence breaking and riots, modern resistance takes both old and new forms. And just as historical resistance mattered even in defeat, because it showed enclosure was contested, not inevitable, today's struggles matter because they demonstrate that alternatives do exist, that the techno-feudal model is not the only possibility. In the workplace, we're seeing efforts to unionize gig economy workers despite platforms' insistence that they're independent contractors rather than workers with collective bargaining rights. In the UK, the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain has won significant legal victories forcing platforms to recognize employment rights. Uber drivers won a Supreme Court case in 2021 establishing their right to minimum wage and holiday pay. Deliveroo riders have organized wildcat strikes, refusing orders during peak times to pressure the platform into negotiations. These struggles face enormous obstacles. The workforce is dispersed, workers never meet each other in a physical workplace, the platforms can deactivate troublemakers, and the legal classification as contractors makes traditional union organizing difficult. But the fact that it's happening at all echoes the early labor movement when factory workers, who were similarly atomized, replaceable, and legally unprotected, began to organize anyway. Platform cooperatives represent an even more direct challenge. Co-op Cycle, a European federation of bike delivery cooperatives, allow local worker-owned collectives to use shared platform technology while maintaining democratic control. These cooperatives are small compared to their corporate competitors, but they prove that the model works. Platforms don't have to be feudal estates. They can be collective infrastructure, democratically governed, oriented toward meeting members' needs rather than maximizing profits for distant shareholders. Beyond the workplace, the movement for digital commons is robust. The open source software movement has created an enormous commons of shared code. Linux, Firefox, and countless other tools exist as free alternatives to proprietary software, maintained by communities rather than corporations. Wikipedia has become the world's most comprehensive encyclopedia, available in hundreds of languages, demonstrating that knowledge production doesn't require profit motive or corporate ownership, although they are currently fighting for their lives against LLMs and AI companies. On a broader scale, movements for land justice are the direct descendants of the historical fight against enclosure. Community land trusts, particularly strong in the UK, take land out of the speculative market permanently, holding it in trust for the community and ensuring it's used for affordable housing rather than profit maximization. The land is collectively owned, democratically governed, and managed for community benefit rather than individual accumulation. It's not a return to the historical commons, the context is too different, but it is an application of commons principles to contemporary housing crisis. The demand for data sovereignty operates on the principle that if data is the new commons, then communities should have the right to own and control their own data collectively. Barcelona's digital sovereignty initiatives, for example, prioritize citizen control over municipal data and open source alternatives to corporate platforms. These are early efforts, but they do represent a conscious collective fight to reclaim the commons. None of these struggles have won in any final sense. The platform cooperatives remain marginal, the land trusts operate at tiny scales compared to the speculative housing market, the digital commons exist in the shadow of platform monopolies, but these efforts matter enormously, just as historical resistance to enclosure mattered even when defeated. They demonstrate that the current system is contested. It proves that alternatives are possible and often work better. They keep alive the knowledge and practice of collective governance and mutual aid. The fight over what gets enclosed and what remains shared, what's privatized and what's collective, continues. It may have moved to new terrain, but it never really ended. And understanding this continuity helps us recognize what's at stake and why it matters. Closing thoughts. The journey from the common fields of England to the algorithmic dashboard of an Amazon warehouse is not a straight line, but a continuous one, tracing the unbroken logic of primitive accumulation. The gig worker tethered to an app, the social media user farming data for a platform, the office worker subjected to digital productivity metrics, are the contemporary heirs of the dispossessed commoner, forced from the land and into a system of dependency and control. This structure of labor relations was built through a long and violent history of enclosure, a process that was perfected domestically in England before being exported globally through colonialism. Commoners dispossessed of land and pushed into wage dependency, indigenous people dispossessed of their territories and forced into colonial labor regimes, women dispossessed of their autonomy and knowledge, their reproductive and care work enclosed within the household and devalued. Each of these dispossessions created the preconditions for capitalism, separating people from their means of independent existence and creating the dependency that makes exploitation possible. Understanding enclosure not as a historical footnote, but as an ongoing process reveals the true nature of our modern struggles. The fight for a fair wage, for digital privacy, for public space, for control over our time is, in essence, the same fight that began centuries ago, a class war against dispossession. It's a fight over whether the essential resources we need to live, land, knowledge, social connection, time, attention, data, will be enclosed and exploited for private profit, or whether they can be held in common and governed democratically by those who use them. The legacy of the commons, with its ethos of reciprocity, solidarity, and democratic stewardship, remains our most powerful tool for imagining and building a more equitable future. The commons existed. It worked in some ways. It sustained communities for centuries through shared governance and collective stewardship. It was destroyed deliberately through violence and law and ideology because it stood in the way of a system that required dispossession to function. This means that our current conditions are not natural or inevitable. They were made. Human history is a long negotiation over how we organize ourselves, how we relate to one another, and what kind of world we want to build and who gets to live well in it. This negotiation takes different shapes across cultures and timelines. Sometimes it looks like enclosure, sometimes like resistance, sometimes like the work of building alternatives. But it never really stops. It's not something that happens to us while we watch from the sidelines. It requires us. It requires our active participation, our willingness to notice when the balance has tipped too far toward extraction and dispossession, our capacity to push back and rebalance. The commons existed because people fought for them, maintained them, defended them. They were destroyed because other people organized to enclose them, and new commons emerge or don't based on whether we're willing to do the work of building and protecting them. The question is not whether this struggle will continue, because it will. The question is whether we'll show up for it. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Utopia of Play, an anthropological lens on the modern workplace. I'm your host, Alina, and this is your local anthropologist.